Millionaire returns from a long trip and discovers that there is a new maid in his house, but the sound of Grace Mitchell's heels echoed through the marble corridors of the Bennett mansion as she meticulously arranged the flowers in the immense crystal vase in the entrance hall. Her delicate hands adjusted each stem with the precision of someone who knew that space intimately. 6 months had passed since she had taken over as housekeeper, and every corner of that Beverly Hills residence seemed to whisper secrets that only she understood. The soft rumble of an engine caught her attention. Through the French windows, Grace watched the black Mercedes-Benz cross the main gates. Her heart raced. Michael Bennett was finally returning from his long trip to Asia. She had been waiting for this moment, planning every detail so that the house would be spotless to welcome him. Michael got out of the car, his crumpled Italian suit showing the long hours of flying. At 45, his posture still emanated the same authority that had made him CEO of one of the country's largest technology companies. However, the tiredness in his blue eyes was evident, along with the gray streaks that were beginning to appear in his brown hair. As he opened the front door, Michael was greeted by the scent of lavender, his late wife Alexandra's favorite. The scent hit him like a wave of memories, making him hesitate for a moment. The house had never been so organized, not even when Margaret, the former housekeeper, worked there. Every object seemed to be exactly where Alexandra used to leave them. "Welcome back, Mr. Bennett." The soft voice surprised him, making him turn abruptly. The world seemed to stop. Michael felt as if he had been struck by lightning. There, standing a few meters away from him, was a woman who could have been Alexandra's twin sister. The same almond-shaped green eyes, the same delicate shape of her face, even the way she tilted her head slightly when she smiled were identical. "You must be." Her voice faltered. "Grace Mitchell, your new housekeeper. Margaret introduced me to the whole house before she retired." Michael had to lean on the nearest wall, his legs staggering. How? When? "Is everything all right, Mr. Bennett? Can I get you a glass of water?" Grace approached, genuinely concerned. "No, He took a deep breath, trying to regain his composure. "Just tired from the trip. The house is different. I hope you like the changes. I followed some suggestions I found in a notebook in the office." Michael's heart froze. Alexandra's notebook. His wife used to write down all her ideas for the house in that little blue-bound book she kept on her desk. No one but her knew of its existence. "What notebook?" she asked, her voice firmer now. Grace hesitated for a moment. "A blue notebook I found when I was organizing the office. It had detailed instructions on the decorations, the flower arrangements, even how to fold the dinner napkins." Michael felt a shiver run down his spine. It was impossible that this woman, who had only arrived 6 months previously, knew so many intimate details about his life with Alexandra. His wife had died 2 years ago in a car accident, taking all his secrets and dreams with her to the house. "I've prepared your room as instructed, Mr. Bennett. Egyptian cotton sheets, goose-feather pillows, and I left a bottle of Voss water next to the bed." Grace continued, seemingly oblivious to the whirlwind of emotions she was provoking in her employer. These were exactly Alexandra's preferences for the couple's bedroom. Details that not even Margaret knew, as Alexandra always made a point of tidying the room herself. "How do you know?" Michael began, but was interrupted by the ringing of his cell phone. It was Stevens, his assistant, reminding him about the video conference with the investors in 30 minutes. "You must be exhausted from your trip. I'll make you some coffee just the way you like it, strong, unsweetened, with a hint of cinnamon." Grace smiled, turning towards the kitchen. Michael watched her walk away, his body trembling slightly. The way she moved, the way she spoke, the way she seemed to know every one of his tastes and preferences, it was disturbing. It was as if Alexandra had come back, but in a different persona. Walking up the stairs towards his office, Michael couldn't shake the feeling that something very strange was happening. Who really was Grace Mitchell? How did she know so much about his life with Alexandra? And why was she so eerily similar to his late wife? The questions multiplied in his mind as he tried to concentrate on preparing for the video conference. But his thoughts kept returning to Grace, to the blue notebook, to the details that only Alexandra knew. There was something more to this story, something he needed to find out. The aroma of cinnamon coffee began to waft up the stairs, enveloping him in another wave of memories. It was as if the past was alive again, breathing through Grace Mitchell, transforming her home into a familiar and at the same time frighteningly mysterious place. Michael knew he wouldn't be able to concentrate on his work until he understood what was going on. Who was this woman who seemed to carry the essence of Alexandra? And why had fate decided to bring her into his life just now? Michael spent a sleepless night going over every detail of his meeting with Grace Mitchell in his mind. The physical resemblance to Alexandra was disturbing enough, but her intimate knowledge of his personal life unsettled him even more. Determined to investigate, he cancelled his morning meetings and began rummaging through the office in search of the mysterious blue notebook. "Looking for something specific, Mr. Bennett?" Grace's voice startled him. She was standing in the doorway holding a breakfast tray. "Actually, yes. You mentioned a blue notebook yesterday." Michael straightened up, trying to keep his composure. "Could you show me where you found it?" Grace deposited the tray on the side table and headed for the antique mahogany bookcase. With surgical precision, her fingers slid into the third compartment, removing the small notebook that Michael recognized instantly. "It's all here," she said, handing it to him. "The notes are quite detailed." Michael flipped through the pages, recognizing Alexandra's delicate handwriting. Her hands trembled slightly as she went through meticulous instructions about the house, from the ideal temperature for each room to the specific arrangement of books in the library. "How did you get hold of this?" she asked, her voice firmer than she felt. "Margaret gave it to me when she took over. She said she found it during a general clean." Grace answered naturally, straightening the office curtains, just as Alexandra used to do every morning. Michael frowned. Margaret had never mentioned the notebook in her 15 years of service. Why would she hand it over to a complete stranger? "I contacted Margaret last night," he lied, watching Grace's reaction carefully. "She doesn't remember handing over any notebooks." Grace paused for a moment, her hands still on the curtains. Maybe she forgot. It was a pretty quick transition after all. "Who are you really, Grace?" Michael stood up, approaching her. "How do you know so many details about my life with Alexandra?" "Mr. Bennett, I understand your confusion." Grace turned to face him, her green eyes identical to Alexandra's. "But I'm your housekeeper. But I'm only your housekeeper. Any resemblance to your late wife is purely coincidental." Just then, Michael's phone rang. It was Stevens again, informing him of an emergency crisis with one of the main investors in Asia. Michael hesitated, torn between the need to resolve the professional situation and the mystery unfolding in his own home. "I need to take this call," he said, still studying Grace's face. "But our conversation isn't over." Grace nodded politely and left the office, leaving behind only the soft scent of lavender that seemed to follow her everywhere. During the video conference, Michael could barely concentrate. His eyes kept returning to the blue notebook on his desk. After ending the call, he began to investigate further. He called old employment agencies, checked references, searched for any information about Grace Mitchell's past. To his surprise, all the documents seemed to be in order. Grace had an impeccable record of working in other luxury residences, although none of her former employers were available to confirm the information personally. In the afternoon, while walking around the house, Michael began to notice other disturbing details. The way Grace organized the kitchen drawers, how she folded the towels in the hall closet, even the arrangement of the cushions in the living room, everything followed a pattern that only Alexandra knew. Determined to find out more, he entered Grace's bedroom during his break. The room was spotless, as expected, but something caught his eye on the dresser. There was a small music box. Michael recognized it immediately. It was identical to the one he had given Alexandra on their first wedding anniversary. His hands trembled as he opened the box. The same soft melody filled the room, Moon River, Alexandra's favorite song. Inside, she found an old yellowed photo. Her heart stopped for a moment. It was a picture of two identical girls, probably around 10 years old. Before she could examine the photograph further, she heard footsteps in the hallway. She quickly put the box back and left the room, her mind spinning with possibilities. Was it possible that Alexandra had a twin sister? Why had she never mentioned it? The rest of the day passed like a blur. Michael watched Grace from afar, noticing every gesture, every mannerism that mirrored Alexandra. In the evening, sitting in his study with a glass of whiskey, he began to dig deeper into his late wife's past. Alexandra had grown up in an orphanage in Portland, that much he knew. But when he investigated the institution's online records, he discovered that a large part of the archives from that time had been destroyed in a fire. It was as if Alexandra's past was protected by a smokescreen. The mystery of Grace Mitchell was deepening, and Michael felt he was only scratching the surface of something much bigger. Who was this woman who seemed to carry not just the appearance, but the very essence of Alexandra? And why had she chosen to appear in his life just now? While these questions consumed him, outside the Beverly Hills night followed its normal course, oblivious to the secrets unfolding inside the Bennett mansion. And somewhere in the house, Grace Mitchell continued her meticulous work, as if her every gesture was a page from the past coming to life again. The investigation into Grace Mitchell's past consumed Michael for the next week. Between corporate meetings and important phone calls, he scoured online records, hired a private investigator, and discreetly tried to observe his new housekeeper's every move. At breakfast on Thursday, a seemingly insignificant detail caught his eye. Grace served toast with blackberry jam, not just any jam, but a specific brand from a small farm in Oregon that Alexandra had discovered during a trip years ago. "Where did you get that jam?" Michael asked, trying to maintain a casual tone. "I found the recipe in a notebook in the kitchen," Grace replied without hesitation. "I found it interesting and decided to recreate it. I hope it turned out like the original." Michael knew he was lying. Alexandra had never written down the recipe. She bought it directly from the farm, which had closed down over a year ago after the elderly owners passed away. That afternoon, the private investigator, Frank Harrison, showed up at his office with his first findings. "Mr. Bennett, I've found something interesting," he said, placing a folder on the desk. "The records of the orphanage in Portland where your wife grew up. There were 2 children abandoned on the same night in 1985, twins." Michael felt his heart racing. "Go on." "One of the girls, Alexandra, was adopted 3 months later by a family in Seattle. The other," Frank hesitated, "mysteriously disappeared from the orphanage 6 months after the separation. There's no record of her after that. And Grace Mitchell, that's where things get murky," Frank explained, showing more documents. "Grace Mitchell has only existed for the last 5 years. Before that, there are no records, no school records, no birth certificate, nothing." Michael leaned back in his chair, processing the information. The possibility of Grace being Alexandra's lost twin sister seemed more and more real, but something still didn't fit. Why show up now, and why work as her housekeeper? A noise in the hallway interrupted her thoughts. Grace walked past, carrying an old box that Michael recognized immediately. It contained Alexandra's photo albums. "Excuse me, Mr. Bennett," she said when she noticed his presence. "I found these photos while cleaning out the attic. I thought they deserved a better place." "Leave them here," Michael ordered more brusquely than he had intended. Grace obeyed, placing the box on a side table before leaving. As soon as he was alone with Frank, Michael began to examine the photos. In the middle of the chronologically organized albums, he found a loose image that made him freeze. It was the same photograph he had seen in Grace's room, the 2 identical girls, but this time there was an inscription on the back: "Alexandra and Elizabeth Portland, 1985. "Elizabeth," Michael muttered. Frank looked up that name. Elizabeth must be the twin sister. While the investigator was taking notes, Michael received an urgent message from Stevens about problems at the Chicago branch. Reluctantly, he had to postpone the investigation to deal with the business crisis. In the evening, when he returned home, he found Grace in the back garden, tending to the white roses, Alexandra's favorites. The twilight bathed her in a way that made her resemblance to his late wife all the more striking. "Elizabeth," Michael called out, testing his theory. Grace stood motionless for a moment, her hands still on the roses. When she turned around, her green eyes were shining with restrained tears. "How long have you known?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "I just found out," Michael replied, stepping closer. "Why didn't you tell me?" "How could I?" Grace, or Elizabeth, let out a restrained sob. "After all these years after losing contact with Alexandra. When I heard about her death, I was devastated. I needed to understand the life my sister had built, to meet the man she loved." Michael felt a mixture of emotions: anger at the lie, compassion for Elizabeth's obvious pain, confusion about how to proceed. "What happened after you were separated at the orphanage?" Elizabeth sat on a bench in the garden, her hands still shaking. "I ran away to try and find Alexandra, but I got lost in the system. I spent years in foster homes, changing names, trying to survive. When I finally got the resources to look for her properly, I found out that she had died. The sun had already set, leaving only the soft illumination of the garden posts. Michael looked at the face that was so familiar and yet so different, the same features as Alexandra, but marked by a completely different history. "Why did you approach me like that secretly?" "I was afraid," she admitted. "Afraid of your reaction, afraid of tarnishing Alexandra's memory. So I decided to get to know him first, to understand the man my sister loved so much. Her notebook helped me understand the life she built here." Michael sat next to her, feeling the weight of the revelations. Elizabeth's presence was both a comfort and a source of pain, a living echo of Alexandra, but also a constant reminder of her absence. "What happens now?" he asked, more to himself than to her. Elizabeth looked at the white roses glowing softly in the darkness. "I don't know, but I'd like to get to know my sister through her memories if you'll let me. Not to replace her, but to understand what a wonderful person she has become." The silence that followed was filled only by the soft rustle of leaves and the distant rumble of Beverly Hills traffic. Michael realized he was at a crossroads. He could push Elizabeth away, protecting himself from the pain her presence evoked, or he could accept this unexpected link to Alexandra's past. The night progressed, and with it the realization that some stories don't end with death but continue to echo through the people we leave behind, waiting for the right moment to be revealed. The morning after the revelation in the garden, Michael watched Elizabeth prepare breakfast through the kitchen door. Her every move was a painful reminder of Alexandra, but now there was a new dimension to her presence, no longer a disturbing mystery, but a tangible connection to his late wife's past. "Stevens called 3 times this morning," Elizabeth commented without turning around. "It sounds urgent." Michael hesitated before entering the kitchen. The familiarity between them had changed dramatically after their conversation the night before, creating an almost palpable tension in the air. "I'll come back later," he replied, taking a seat at the kitchen island. "We need to talk more about yesterday." Elizabeth nodded, placing a cup of coffee in front of him. "Where do you want to start?" "The beginning. What really happened at the orphanage?" Elizabeth took a deep breath, her eyes fixed on the kitchen window. "Alexandra and I were inseparable. When she was adopted, something inside me broke. I spent weeks crying, refusing to eat. Then one stormy night I ran away. At just 10 years old. I was young and desperate," she continued finally, turning to face him. "I thought I could find the family that took Alexandra, but I ended up on the streets of Portland. A social worker found me 3 days later and put me in a temporary home in Seattle." Michael noticed how his hands were shaking slightly as he poured more coffee. "Why didn't you try to find her later?" "I tried for years, but each foster family took me to a different city: Sacramento, Denver, Detroit. I lost count of how many times I had to start over. When I finally got the stability and resources to look for her properly, I found out about the accident. Michael's phone rang again. Stevens for the fourth time. He silenced it with an irritated gesture. "And how did you find out about the notebook?" he asked, remembering the object that had started the whole investigation. "Actually, I already knew about it," Elizabeth admitted, taking a seat facing Michael. "Alexandra and I had a secret code as children. She always said that she would keep her most important secrets in a blue notebook. When I saw the news of her death, I knew I had to find it." Michael processed the information slowly. "So, you didn't find it by chance?" "No, I researched the house, the life she built here. I got the job specifically to get access to the notebook. But then," she hesitated, "something changed." "What changed?" "I got to know you through her stories. The notebook didn't just have instructions about the house it had. Pages and pages about your relationship, about how you made her happy, about the little moments she treasured." The distant sound of an ambulance momentarily broke the silence that followed. Michael stood up, walking over to the window overlooking the garden. Why continue with the farce after finding the notebook? Elizabeth followed his gaze. "Because, for the first time in years, I felt I was close to her again. Every corner of this house tells a story about Alexandra, about the life she loved. I couldn't leave." Michael turned to face her. "And now?" Elizabeth hesitated. "Now I'd like to get to know my sister through her memories, not as her housekeeper, but as someone who loved her as much as you did." Before Michael could reply, Stevens burst through the kitchen door, panting. "Mr. Bennett, I tried to call. It's about the project in Chicago. There's been a leak of confidential information. The press is speculating about irregularities." Michael cursed softly. "Get the jet ready. I need to be in Chicago in 3 hours." As Stevens hurried off, Michael turned to Elizabeth. "We need to continue this conversation when I get back." "I'll be here," she replied softly. Michael went upstairs to pack a small suitcase, his mind divided between the business crisis and the morning's revelations. On his way down, he found Elizabeth in the foyer with her coat. "I left your laptop and documents organized in the brown folder," she said, handing him the coat. "And I put your headache medicine in the inside pocket you always needed on long flights." Michael froze. This was exactly what Alexandra did when he needed to travel in a hurry. The gesture, so familiar and at the same time different, coming from Elizabeth, caused a wave of conflicting emotions. "Thank you," was all he managed to say before leaving. During the drive to the airport, Michael reflected on how drastically his life had changed in just 1 week. Elizabeth's presence was both a comfort and a source of confusion. She carried part of Alexandra with her, but she was her own person, with her own story of loss and searching. As the car drove through Los Angeles, Michael realized that he was faced with a crucial decision. Could he keep Elizabeth in his life as a link to Alexandra's past? Or would he need to create clear boundaries to protect his own memories and emotions? The driver announced that they had arrived at the airport, bringing Michael back to the present. The crisis in Chicago demanded his immediate attention, but he knew that his biggest battle would be deciding how to deal with this unexpected connection to the past that Elizabeth represented. The turbulence on the flight to Chicago jolted Michael out of his restless thoughts about Elizabeth. The corporate crisis demanded his full attention, but the revelations of the last 24 hours insisted on occupying his mind. When he landed at O'Hare International Airport, Stevens was already waiting for him in the private terminal with a tense expression. "The leak is worse than we thought," Stevens informed him as they made their way to the car. "Someone in the finance department shared confidential documents about the negotiations in Asia." Michael barely processed the words as they drove through downtown Chicago. The reflection of the sun in the mirrored windows of the skyscrapers reminded him of the gleam in Elizabeth's eyes when she finally revealed her true identity. "Mr. Bennett," Stevens interrupted his thoughts. "The lawyers are waiting for us." The emergency meeting at the law firm lasted for hours. Between discussions about legal strategies and damage containment plans, Michael received a message from Elizabeth. I found more letters from her in the attic. Some are addressed to me." His heart raced. Alexandra had never mentioned writing letters to a lost sister. What other secrets had his late wife kept? "We need your decision now, Mr. Bennett," insisted Richard Morton, the head lawyer, bringing Michael back to the reality of the meeting room on the 47th floor. "Proceed with the internal audit," Michael ordered, finally focusing on the problem at hand, "and prepare a press release." It was after 9 in the evening when Michael finally arrived at the Four Seasons, where he always stayed in Chicago. In his room, he called Elizabeth by video call, something he had never imagined doing a week ago. "The letters," he said as soon as she picked up. "Have you read them?" Elizabeth hesitated, her green eyes so identical to Alexandra's shining with restrained tears. "A few. They're mainly from when she was at college. She never stopped looking for me, Michael." The revelation hit Michael like a punch in the gut. Alexandra had always seemed so secretive about her past at the orphanage, and now he understood why. "There's a specific letter," Elizabeth continued, her voice trembling slightly, "dated 3 months before the accident. She had hired a private investigator to find me." Michael sat down heavily in the armchair in the bedroom. "Why didn't she ever tell me?" "The letter mentions that she wanted to be sure before telling you. She didn't want to create any expectations." Elizabeth paused. "Michael, she was close to meeting me when—" The silence that followed was deafening. Michael could hear his own heart beating as he processed the information. Alexandra had died carrying this secret, this unfulfilled desire to be reunited with her twin sister. "There's one more thing," Elizabeth said softly. "I found documents about a bank account. Alexandra had started a fund for when she found me." Michael closed his eyes, remembering how Alexandra had always insisted on keeping a separate account for personal projects. At the time, he had assumed it was for her charitable works. "I have to go back to Chicago next week for a hearing," he said after a moment. "When I get back, I want to see all the letters." "Michael," Elizabeth called out before he could end the call, "there's something I need to tell you in person. Something I found along with the last letters." The hesitation in her voice alerted him. "What is it?" "Not over the phone. It's too important." Elizabeth stopped, and for a moment her resemblance to Alexandra was almost unbearable. "It's to do with the accident." Michael felt a shiver run down his spine. The car accident that had taken Alexandra's life had always seemed tragically simple: a rainy night, a dangerous bend in the Pacific Coast Highway. But Elizabeth's tone suggested something more. "Wait for my return," he finally said. "And Elizabeth, thank you for telling me about the letters." After ending the call, Michael lay awake for hours, mentally going over the last few months of Alexandra's life. Were there signs he had missed? Moments when she might have tried to share her secret? The next morning, as Chicago awoke to a fine drizzle, Michael prepared to face the press. But his mind was torn between the corporate crisis and the mystery deepening in his own home. What had Elizabeth found out about the accident? And why had Alexandra kept so many secrets? The gray city seemed to reflect his state of mind as he watched from his office window. Each new revelation about Alexandra made him question how much he had really known the woman he had been married to. And now, through Elizabeth, the past was gradually coming to light, promising more surprises, some possibly too painful to face. Stevens knocked on the door, reminding him of the upcoming press conference. Michael adjusted his tie, preparing to face the cameras and reporters. But a part of him was already in Beverly Hills, anxious to discover what other secrets Alexandra had left behind in her letters, and what dark truth Elizabeth had uncovered about the night that had changed her life forever. The meeting room in the Chicago office emptied after the press conference. Michael remained seated, his eyes fixed on the tablet in front of him, where a photo of Alexandra's accident flashed across the screen. The image of the silver Mercedes, smashed against the guardrail on the Pacific Coast Highway, had never ceased to haunt him. But now, with Elizabeth's words echoing in his mind, every detail seemed to cry out for a new interpretation. "Mr. Bennett?" Stevens entered the room with a brown folder. "I found something that might interest you. It's Alexandra's phone records from the day of the accident. Michael looked up, suddenly alert. Why are you bringing this to me now? After you mentioned the letters Elizabeth found, I decided to go through some old files. Stevens hesitated. There's a series of calls to a specific number in the weeks before the accident. The last contact was made 30 minutes before. Before what? Michael stood up abruptly. Before she lost control of the car. Michael picked up the folder with trembling hands. The records showed dozens of calls to the same number, all lasting between 2 and 5 minutes. The last call, made at 22:47, lasted exactly 12 minutes. Trace that number, Michael ordered, his voice tense. And cancel my appointments for this afternoon. I need to get back to Los Angeles immediately. During the return flight, Michael couldn't stop thinking about the implications of this discovery. Alexandra had died at 11:15 p.m., according to the police report. What had happened on that last call, and why was she driving down the PCH so late at night? Her cell phone vibrated with a message from Elizabeth. We need to talk as soon as you arrive. It's about the private investigator Alexandra hired. Michael felt his stomach turn. Each new piece of the puzzle seemed to make the picture darker. The turbulence shook the plane, but the real turmoil was in his mind, filled with disturbing theories and possibilities. When he landed at LAX, he found Elizabeth waiting in the private terminal. Dressed in a navy blue blazer and black slacks, she looked more like an executive than a housekeeper. The resemblance to Alexandra was still striking, but Michael was beginning to notice the subtle differences, a more cautious look, a more rigid posture. The investigator, Elizabeth began as soon as they got into the car. His name was Robert Kincaid. Alexandra hired him 3 months before the accident to track me down. And did he succeed? Michael asked, watching her reaction carefully. Yes. Elizabeth removed a yellowed envelope from her briefcase. I found his final report hidden inside a book in his office. He tracked me down in Seattle, where I was working as a financial consultant under the name Grace Mitchell. Michael frowned. So you already knew about Alexandra when you came to work for me? No. Elizabeth shook her head. I moved from Seattle before she could contact me. I only found out about the report yesterday along with the letters. Los Angeles traffic flowed slowly as they digested this information. The Californian afternoon sun cast long shadows across the skyscrapers, creating a play of light and dark that seemed to reflect the deepening mystery. There's more, Elizabeth continued, her voice trembling slightly. Kincaid died in a car accident 2 weeks after delivering the final report to Alexandra. On the same road, on the same stretch of PCH. Michael felt a shiver run down his spine. Coincidence? Maybe. Elizabeth hesitated. But I found notes from her suggesting that someone was trying to prevent us from meeting. She mentioned threat surveillance. Why? Michael interrupted. Who would care that much about keeping you apart? I don't know, Elizabeth replied, her green eyes fixed on his. But Alexandra discovered something big enough to... Michael's cell phone rang, interrupting the conversation. It was Stevens. Mr. Bennett, we traced the number. It belonged to Robert Kincaid. Michael hung up without answering, his mind quickly processing the implications. Alexandra had spoken to Kincaid minutes before she died. The same Kincaid who would die weeks later on the same stretch of road. I need to see all the letters and documents you found, he told Elizabeth as the car pulled up to the gates of the Beverly Hills mansion. Every note, every detail could be important. Elizabeth nodded, guiding him to the office where she had meticulously organized all the material she had discovered. On the mahogany desk, dozens of letters, photographs, and documents were arranged chronologically. Alexandra started writing. These letters to me when she was 16, Elizabeth explained, picking up a bundle of yellowed envelopes. She never gave up on finding me. As they examined the material, the sun began to set, casting an orange glow through the office windows. The shadows lengthened, as if trying to reach the secrets scattered on the table. Michael picked up one of the last letters, dated a week before the accident. Alexandra's handwriting, usually so precise, showed signs of haste or agitation. Elizabeth, I've finally discovered the truth. Everything makes sense now why we were separated, why they tried so hard to keep us apart. I need to find you before it's too late. There are powerful people who would do anything to keep this secret buried. The letter ended abruptly as if Alexandra had been interrupted while writing it. Michael looked at Elizabeth, who had visibly paled. Her accident, Elizabeth whispered. Wasn't an accident, was it? The question hung in the air like a dark cloud, carrying with it the weight of a truth that was beginning to reveal itself. A truth that could be more dangerous than either of them had imagined. The discovery that Alexandra's accident might have been planned turned the Bennett mansion into a makeshift investigation center. Michael and Elizabeth spent the entire night analyzing documents, connecting dots, and developing theories about who could be behind it all. We need to talk to someone who knew Alexandra back then, Michael said, massaging his temples as he looked at the pile of documents on the table. Someone who might know what she found out in the weeks before the accident. Elizabeth, who was organizing the letters by date, looked up. In the last few letters, she often mentioned someone, Dr. Patricia Morrison. It seems she was her therapist. Alexandra never mentioned a therapist. Michael frowned, picking up the letters Elizabeth had indicated. According to these letters, she started sessions 3 months before the accident, just after hiring Kincaid. Elizabeth hesitated before continuing. And there's something else interesting. Dr. Morrison worked at the orphanage in Portland at the time Alexandra and I were separated. Michael felt his heart race. Do you think she could be the connection? It's possible. Alexandra wrote that Dr. Morrison held the answers to our past. A quick online search revealed that Patricia Morrison still maintained an office in Santa Monica. Michael wasted no time. He immediately called Stevens and asked him to make an appointment under an assumed name for that very morning. I'm going alone, Michael decided as Elizabeth began to prepare to accompany him. If someone really is involved in Alexandra's death, we need to be careful. Your resemblance to her would draw too much attention. Elizabeth protested at first, but eventually agreed. Be careful, and take this. She handed him a small digital recorder. We need to record everything she says. Dr. Morrison's office was in an elegant building overlooking the Pacific Ocean. The secretary led Michael into a waiting room, decorated in soft shades of blue and beige, clearly designed to convey calm and tranquility. Mr. James Anderson. Dr. Morrison appeared at the door, a woman of about 60 with perfectly groomed gray hair and keen eyes behind thin-rimmed glasses. Michael entered the office, his heart beating hard against the tape recorder hidden in his jacket pocket. The room was spacious with large windows offering a panoramic view of the ocean. How can I help you today? The therapist asked, taking a seat in her leather armchair. Michael studied her face for a moment before answering. Actually, Dr. Morrison, I've come to talk to you about Alexandra Bennett. The therapist's professional smile faltered for a split second. I'm sorry, but I can't discuss other patients. Even patients who died in suspicious circumstances after discovering secrets about their past. Michael leaned forward. Secrets you've helped keep since the orphanage in Portland. Dr. Morrison kept her composure, but her fingers tightened slightly on the armrests. I don't know what you're talking about, Mr. Anderson. Or should I say Mr. Bennett? Yes, you do. Alexandra discovered something in the weeks before she died. Something to do with her separation from her twin sister. Something that scared her enough to write about powerful people wanting to keep secrets buried. A heavy silence filled, the room broken only by the distant sound of the Pacific waves. Dr. Morrison stood up and walked over to the window, her rigid posture betraying her apparent calm. Some things are better left undiscovered, Mr. Bennett, she finally said, her voice low but firm. Alexandra learned that the hard way. What exactly did she find out? The therapist turned to face him, her eyes suddenly tired. She discovered that the twin separation wasn't accidental. It was part of a deal, a very lucrative deal involving very influential people. What kind of deal? The kind that involves millions of dollars and powerful families who couldn't have children. Dr. Morrison sat back down. The orphanage was just a front for a much larger operation. Twins were especially valuable, one for legal adoption, the other for other arrangements. Michael felt his stomach turn. And Alexandra found out about this. She started putting the pieces together when she found old documents from the orphanage. She sought my help because she knew about my past involvement with the institution. The therapist ran a hand through her gray hair. I tried to warn her to drop the subject, but she was determined to find her sister and expose the whole scheme. And then she died in an accident. Michael added, his voice laced with bitterness. Just like the private investigator she hired. Dr. Morrison sighed deeply. Mr. Bennett, these people, the families involved, the facilitators, the doctors, they've built entire lives on these secrets. They have a lot to lose if the truth comes out. And now Elizabeth is back. Michael muttered, more to himself than to the therapist. Dr. Morrison's eyes widened. Elizabeth is alive. Is she here in Los Angeles? Why the sudden interest? Because if she's alive and close to you, then... The therapist was interrupted by the sound of breaking glass. A small hole appeared in the window behind her, and at the same moment Dr. Morrison staggered forward, a red stain spreading rapidly across her back. Michael acted on instinct, throwing himself to the floor and pulling the therapist with him. Tau. More shots came through the window, hitting the opposite wall. Drawer of the desk, Dr. Morrison whispered with difficulty. Red file. Everything's there. As sirens began to sound in the distance, Michael realized that he had plunged into something much bigger and more dangerous than he could have imagined. The mystery of Alexandra's death wasn't just about two separate sisters. It was about a conspiracy that spanned decades and involved some of the most powerful families in the country. And now he and Elizabeth were at the center of it all. The shooting in Dr. Morrison's office turned into a chaos of sirens and red and blue lights flashing against the shattered glass windows. Michael remained crouched beside the wounded therapist, pressing his jacket against the wound in her back as he waited for the paramedics to arrive. The file, Dr. Morrison whispered again, her voice growing weaker. Promise me you'll protect Elizabeth. Before Michael could reply, the paramedics burst into the room. In the midst of the confusion, he managed to reach into the desk drawer and grab the red file, hiding it inside his briefcase while the medical professionals attended to the therapist. Mr. Bennett, a detective with a tired expression, approached. I'm Detective Marcus Rodriguez. We need your statement about what happened. Michael watched Dr. Morrison being carried away on the stretcher. Can I do that later? I need to take care of some urgent matters. Sir, there's been an attempted murder. We need to... And I'm the only witness I know. Michael interrupted, his mind racing. I'll be at the police station in 2 hours, I promise. Without waiting for an answer, Michael left the building through the back door, avoiding the reporters, who were already beginning to crowd around the main entrance. He called Elizabeth as soon as he got into his car. We need to get out of the mansion, now. Her voice was urgent. Take only the essentials and meet me at the Four Seasons in Beverly Hills. Use the service entrance and register as Ann Cooper. Michael, what happened, are you? I'll explain everything in person, just be careful. I think we're being watched. As he drove through the streets of Los Angeles, Michael couldn't stop thinking about Dr. Morrison's revelations. A baby trafficking scheme involving powerful families would explain why someone was willing to kill to keep the secret. But what was the connection with Alexandra and Elizabeth specifically? At the hotel, Michael waited anxiously in the lobby, disguised by a cap and sunglasses. Elizabeth arrived 20 minutes later, carrying only a small suitcase. I've brought all the documents we could find, she whispered as they went up in the elevator, including Alexandra's last letters. In the bedroom, Michael locked the door and closed the curtains before taking the red file out of the briefcase. Elizabeth sat next to him on the king-size bed as he spread out the documents. My God! Elizabeth gasped when she saw the first few pages. These are records from the orphanage. Dozens of pairs of twins, all separated between 1980 and 1995. Michael found a list of names and amounts. They look like payments, millions of dollars per child. Wait, Elizabeth picked up an old photograph. Is this woman, Dr. Morrison? The photograph showed a younger Patricia Morrison, standing next to a distinguished-looking man in front of the Portland orphanage. The caption identified the man as Charles Whitman, a name Michael recognized immediately. Charles Whitman was one of the institution's biggest donors, Michael said, his mind connecting the dots. And he was also Alexandra's adoptive father. Elizabeth paled. Do you think? Alexandra was chosen specifically by the Whitmans, Michael added, while you. I was sold to another family. Elizabeth finished, her voice trembling. But why did Alexandra start investigating this after so long? Michael picked up one of Alexandra's latest letters, rereading a specific passage. I found out something about Dad today. Something terrible. I need to find Elizabeth before it's too late. If anything happens to me, look in the Whitman Foundation archives. The Whitman Foundation, Michael muttered. Of course. Charles Whitman used the foundation as a front to launder the money from the illegal adoption scheme. And Alexandra found out, Elizabeth concluded. That's why they killed her. She was threatening to expose not only the scheme but also the reputation of one of the most powerful families in Los Angeles. A sound in the hallway made them both freeze. Footsteps approached the room. Michael signaled Elizabeth to hide in the bathroom while he positioned himself next to the door, his heart hammering in his chest. The footsteps stopped in front of the room. A shadow appeared under the door. Michael held his breath, preparing for the worst. The silence was broken by the sound of Michael's cell phone. It was Stevens. Chief. Stevens's voice was tense. Dr. Morrison. She didn't survive the surgery. Michael closed his eyes, feeling the weight of the news. One more death to cover up the truth. The shadow under the door had disappeared, but he knew it was only a matter of time before those responsible found them. Stevens, I need you to do something for me, Michael said quietly. Go to the Whitman Foundation archives. Look for anything related to the Portland orphanage between 1980 and 1995. Elizabeth came out of the bathroom, her green eyes so similar to Alexandra's, shining with determination. We'll expose everything, she said firmly. For Alexandra. For all the other children who have been separated. Michael nodded, knowing that they had just declared war on some of the most powerful and dangerous people in Los Angeles. But he owed it to Alexandra. He owed it to Elizabeth. And he owed it to all the families that had been destroyed by greed and power. Night was falling over Beverly Hills, and somewhere in the city, powerful people were already planning their next move. The war for the truth was just beginning. Michael was startled awake by the sound of notifications on his cell phone. Stevens had sent a series of digitized files from the Whitman Foundation documents that shed a sinister light on decades of corruption and family tragedies. We need to move, Elizabeth said, already dressed and organizing the documents in her briefcase. It's not safe for us to stay in one place for too long. The Four Seasons, despite its luxury and security, had become a potential trap. Michael knew that luxury hotels were the first places where powerful people would look for them. As they prepared to leave, he studied the files sent by Stevens. Look at this, Michael called out to Elizabeth, showing her a specific document. Charles Whitman made a series of suspicious bank transfers to a company called New Horizons Adoption Services between 1985 and 1990. Elizabeth leaned over the document, her profile painfully reminiscent of Alexandra. The dates correspond exactly to the period when we were in the orphanage. And there's more. Michael continued, sliding to the next file. New Horizons was shut down abruptly in 1995 after a federal investigation, but all the records mysteriously disappeared before investigators could access them. Convenient, Elizabeth muttered, her tone bitter. How are we going to prove anything if all the evidence has been destroyed? Not all of it. Michael picked up his phone. Stevens, I need you to search all the Whitman Foundation's bank records for the last 30 years. Look for patterns of similar transfers to other adoption agencies. While Stevens worked, Michael and Elizabeth discreetly left the hotel through the service exit. The black Mercedes that Michael had rented under an assumed name was waiting for them in the underground parking lot. "Where are we going?" Elizabeth asked as they left Beverly Hills. "I have a beach house in Malibu that not many people know about." Michael replied, his eyes constantly checking the rearview mirror. "Alexandra and I bought it as a refuge, but we kept it a secret. Not even the Whitmans knew about it." The mention of Alexandra brought a heavy silence to the car. Elizabeth stared out of the window, watching the landscape of the Pacific Coast Highway, the same road where her sister had lost her life. "Michael," she said softly, "do you think Charles knew about Alexandra's accident?" The question hung in the air like a dark cloud. Michael gripped the steering wheel tightly, remembering his last interactions with his father-in-law. Charles had seemed genuinely devastated by his daughter's death, but now all past reactions needed to be reevaluated. "I don't know," he replied honestly, "but I intend to find out." The cell phone rang again, Stevens with more information. "Boss, I found something. The Whitman Foundation has made regular donations to 5 different adoption agencies over the course of 20 years. All of them were shut down under suspicious circumstances." "Send me everything you found," Michael instructed. "And Stevens, be careful. You may be being monitored." The beach house appeared on the horizon, a modern, discreet structure partially hidden by native vegetation. Michael turned on the automated gate and parked in the underground garage. "Alexandra loved this place," he commented as he led Elizabeth inside. "She said that here she could truly be herself, away from the Whitmans' expectations." Elizabeth ran her fingers along the glass wall overlooking the ocean. "She mentioned this house in her letters. She said it was her safe haven." While Elizabeth explored the space, Michael began organizing the documents on the dining table, creating a timeline of events. The pattern that emerged was disturbing. Since the 1980s, the Whitman Foundation had moved millions of dollars through different adoption agencies, all connected to twin separation cases. "Michael," Elizabeth called out from the living room, "I found something." She was holding an old book taken from one of the bookshelves. Between its pages, several old photos had fallen out. One of them showed Charles Whitman at a meeting with other distinguished-looking men. "Turn the picture over," Michael suggested. On the back was an annotation in Alexandra's handwriting. "Annual Board Meeting, Whitman Foundation, 1985. Dad and the other benefactors planning more special adoptions." "She knew," Elizabeth whispered. "Alexandra found out everything and was gathering evidence." The sound of an approaching car made them both freeze. Through the windows, they saw a black SUV pull up in front of the house. 2 men in suits got out of the vehicle. "Through the garage," Michael whispered quickly, collecting the most important documents. "There's a walkway that leads to the beach." As they moved silently towards the garage, they heard the sound of the doorbell. Seconds later, the distinct sound of a lock being forced. The hunt had begun, and now Michael and Elizabeth were racing against time to expose a truth that could cost them their lives. The issue was no longer just about justice for Alexandra, it was about survival. The sand of Malibu Beach sank beneath Michael and Elizabeth's feet as they ran through the narrow passage that connected the garage to the shore. The sound of the waves masked their hurried steps, but also made it difficult to hear if they were being followed. "This way," Michael whispered, guiding Elizabeth to a rock formation that created a small natural retreat. From their position, they could observe the house without being seen. The 2 men in suits were now methodically searching every room in the house, their silhouettes moving behind the glass windows. Elizabeth held the folder with the documents tightly against her chest, her body trembling slightly, not from fear, but from restrained anger. "We need help," Michael muttered, reaching for his cell phone. He hesitated for a moment. Before dialing a number he vowed never to use again. After 3 rings, a familiar female voice answered. "Catherine Morgan." "Kate, it's Michael Bennett." I need that favor you owe me." There was a tense pause on the other end of the line. Catherine Morgan was a federal prosecutor and Alexandra's old college classmate. Years ago, Michael had helped her cover up a family scandal that would have destroyed her career. "Where are you?" Catherine asked, her professional tone masking her concern. "I can't tell you over the phone, but I need you to access the federal files on the 1995 New Horizons Adoption Services investigation." "Michael, those files have been sealed by court order." "Exactly, and I bet you know why." Another moment of silence. "Meet me at Pier 23 in Santa Monica in an hour. Come alone." "I can't. Elizabeth is with me." "Elizabeth?" Catherine's voice trembled slightly. "Alexandra's sister." "Yes. And Kate, Dr. Morrison was murdered today." A muffled sound of surprise. "My God, everything is connected, isn't it? More than we imagined." 1 hour Pier 23. Michael hung up and watched the men leave the house, apparently frustrated at not finding them. The black SUV set off in the direction of the Pacific Coast Highway. "Can we trust her?" Elizabeth asked, her green eyes so disturbingly familiar fixed on Michael. Catherine was more than Alexandra's friend. She was her confidant. Michael started walking along the beach, keeping close to the rocks. "And she has access to information that could prove the Whitman Foundation's entire scheme." As they walked towards Santa Monica, Elizabeth shared more details from Alexandra's letters. In recent weeks, she mentioned secret foundation meetings at a property in Calabasas. She said that's where the deals were made. Michael nodded, remembering Charles Whitman casually mentioning that property a few times. "Stevens is looking for records of all the children who passed through there." They arrived at Pier 23 10 minutes early. The place, a small seaside cafe frequented mainly by local fishermen, was practically empty at that hour. Catherine Morgan was already waiting for them at a table at the back, her elegant posture contrasting with the rustic surroundings. At 45, she maintained the same intimidating presence as in the federal courts. "My God," she whispered when she saw Elizabeth. "It's like seeing a ghost." "We're short on time," Michael interrupted, taking a seat. "What do you know about the 95 investigation?" Catherine opened her briefcase, revealing a series of documents. The investigation was dropped for lack of evidence, but the truth is that there was massive political pressure. 3 federal investigators were mysteriously transferred, a judge suddenly retired, and all the key witnesses disappeared. "Like Dr. Morrison," Elizabeth commented bitterly. "Exactly. But they made a mistake." Catherine smiled slightly, pulling a USB stick from her blazer. "I always keep backup copies of cases that seem too convenient." The sound of dishes breaking in the kitchen startled the 3 of them. Michael noticed a suspicious movement near the counter, a man in a dark jacket who seemed out of place. "Back exit, now," he muttered, picking up the USB stick. They had barely stood up when the first shot hit the wall behind them. Panic ensued in the cafe, with customers screaming and throwing themselves on the floor. Michael pushed Elizabeth and Catherine towards the kitchen as more shots rang out. "My car's in the alley," Catherine shouted as they ran between pots and pans and frightened staff. They reached Catherine's black BMW and quickly got in. She sped down the narrow alley, skidding as she made the turn onto the main street. "The USB stick," Catherine said as she drove, "contains all the original witness statements, including one from the Whitman Foundation's former accountant detailing how the money was laundered." Michael plugged the USB stick into his laptop, eager to access the information that could finally expose the whole truth. But before he could open any files, a violent side impact sent the car spinning. The black SUV had found them. The impact of the black SUV caused Catherine's BMW to spin violently on the Santa Monica Boulevard. Michael instinctively shielded Elizabeth as the car skidded, finally coming to a stop against a fire hydrant that exploded, creating a curtain of water. "Get out of the car," Catherine shouted, blood dripping from a cut on her forehead. "Through the passenger door." Michael helped Elizabeth out, pulling her away from the jet of water, while Catherine retrieved her briefcase and laptop. The black SUV maneuvered its way back, its wheels singing on the wet asphalt. "This way," Michael guided the two into a narrow alleyway between two office buildings. The sound of gunfire ricocheting off the walls made them run faster, their footsteps echoing on the wet concrete. "I know a safe place," Catherine gasped as they ran. "There's a safe in my office with more evidence. Documents that Alexandra gave me weeks before she died." Elizabeth stumbled, almost falling. "Why haven't you mentioned this before?" "Because I promised Alexandra that I would only reveal them if something happened to her, and if you reappeared," Catherine replied, leading them through a series of interconnected alleyways. Catherine's office was in a restored Art Deco building in the center of Santa Monica. Using a service entrance, they quickly went up to the 12th floor. "Quick!" Catherine typed in a code on a discreet panel behind a painting in her living room. A section of the wall slid away, revealing a small safe. Alexandra knew she was being followed. She started gathering evidence against the Whitman Foundation months before she died. Michael watched the door as Catherine opened the safe. Elizabeth, still shaking from the accident, examined the documents on the flash drive in her cell phone. "My God," Elizabeth whispered. "There's a list here. Dozens of children, all twins, all separated between 1980 and 1995. And all sold to powerful families through the Whitman Foundation," Catherine added, pulling a thick folder out of the safe. "Charles Whitman wasn't just a benefactor, he was the architect of the whole scheme." Michael took the folder quickly, flipping through its contents. There were photos, bank documents, and most disturbingly detailed medical records for each pair of twins. "They didn't just separate the children," Michael said, his voice shaking with anger. "They selected them based on specific characteristics. It was a human catalog." The sound of the elevator arriving on the floor made everyone freeze. Heavy footsteps echoed in the corridor. "Is there another way out?" Michael whispered. Catherine nodded, moving silently to a side door. "Fire escape. It leads down to the underground parking lot." As they hurried down the metal steps, Elizabeth continued examining the documents on her cell phone. "There's something else here. Records of regular payments to bailiffs' investigators. The corruption goes beyond the foundation." Catherine explained, her breathing heavy from the descent. "It's a whole network of powerful people protecting their secrets." In the underground parking lot, Catherine guided them to a spare car, a discreet sedan she kept for emergencies. "We need to hand over this evidence to the media," Elizabeth said as they got into the car. "It's the only way to ensure that the truth comes out." "Not just any media," Michael replied, starting the car. "We need someone who can't be bought or threatened." "I know someone," Catherine said from the back seat, still typing on her cell phone. "An investigative journalist for the Washington Post. She's tried to expose the Whitman Foundation before, but never had enough evidence." The sound of gunfire again echoed through the parking lot. Michael accelerated towards the exit, the tires singing on the sharp curves of the ramp. "Lauren Maxwell," Catherine continued, holding on as the car made another sharp turn. "She's in Los Angeles investigating connections between charitable organizations and money laundering." "How long before we can get a meeting with her?" Michael asked, looking through the rearview mirror at the headlights of the SUV that was chasing them. "She can meet us in an hour," Catherine replied. "There's a safe place in Venice Beach." Elizabeth held the documents tightly against her chest, her pale face reflecting in the car windows. Alexandra died trying to expose this truth. "We can't fail her now." Michael took her free hand, squeezing it gently. The resemblance to Alexandra was even more pronounced in that moment of determination, the same sparkle in her green eyes, the same inner strength he had so admired in his late wife. "We won't fail," he promised, maneuvering the car through the Santa Monica traffic. "We'll finish them all off, for Alexandra, for you, for all the families they've destroyed." The sun was beginning to set over the Pacific, painting the sky in orange hues that contrasted with the darkness of the situation they found themselves in. Somewhere in the city, Charles Whitman and his associates probably already knew that their empire of secrets was about to crumble. The race against time and against people willing to kill to keep their secrets had only just begun. The sun had completely disappeared when Michael, Elizabeth, and Catherine arrived at the meeting point in Venice Beach, an old warehouse converted into an art studio. Lauren Maxwell was waiting for them at the back entrance, her experienced gaze quickly assessing the situation. "You guys look like you've had a hard time," Lauren commented, guiding them into the studio. The space was large, with several partitions creating semi-private areas. Photography and lighting equipment were strategically positioned, providing cover and vantage points. "We need guarantees," Michael said, still firmly holding the folder with the documents. "If anything happens to us—" "I've already made arrangements," Lauren interrupted, pointing to a laptop connected to several monitors. "We're streaming this conversation live to secure servers in 3 different countries. I have a team ready to publish everything in 15 media outlets simultaneously." Elizabeth began organizing the documents on a work table, her hands shaking slightly as she sorted the evidence by category. "Here are the bank records, the photos of the secret meetings, and the witness statements." Lauren examined the material with attentive eyes, decades of journalistic experience evident in her concentrated expression. "This is much bigger than I imagined. The Whitman Foundation wasn't just a child trafficking operation, it was the center of an international network. And Alexandra discovered it all," Catherine added, showing her the notes her friend had left. "She started investigating when she found discrepancies in the Foundation's financial records." Michael watched the city through the studio, windows his thoughts returning to the last few days he had spent with Alexandra. She was different in the weeks before the accident, distant, worried. Now I understand why. A noise on the roof made everyone freeze. Lauren quickly switched off the main lights, leaving only the soft glow of the monitors illuminating the space. "I have security guards positioned around the perimeter," she whispered, moving silently to a control panel. "If anyone tries to get in—" The sound of breaking glass upstairs interrupted her sentence. Michael pulled Elizabeth behind a partition while Catherine and Lauren positioned themselves in opposite corners of the studio. "Continue broadcasting," Lauren ordered through a discreet communicator. "No matter what happens, this information needs to come out." Heavy footsteps echoed above them. Elizabeth held the USB stick containing the evidence tightly, her face determined despite the fear evident in her eyes. "Michael," she whispered, "if something happens—" "It won't," he interrupted, taking her hand. "Let's finish what Alexandra started." Lauren silently signaled to an emergency staircase, partially hidden by photographic equipment. "That exit leads straight into a maintenance tunnel. I can buy you some time while you—" An explosion on the top floor shook the building, followed by the sound of multiple footsteps descending the stairs. Smoke began to seep through the ceiling, making the air thick and suffocating. "File sent," Lauren announced, her fingers flying over the keyboard. "In 10 minutes, everything will be public." The main door of the studio burst open and armed men burst in. Michael recognized 2 of them, the same ones who had broken into his house in Malibu. "Mr. Bennett," a familiar voice echoed from the darkness. Charles Whitman emerged from the smoke, his impeccable suit contrasting with the chaos around him. "You shouldn't have gotten involved in this." Elizabeth stood up, facing the man who had adopted her twin sister. How could you break up families, destroy lives? You don't understand," Charles replied, his voice cold. "Some families deserve children more than others. We just redistribute resources." "Resources." Michael stepped forward, anger evident in his voice. "They were children, and you killed your own daughter to protect your secrets." A cruel smile formed on Charles' lips. Alexandra should have stayed out of it. She had everything money, social, standing a perfect life. But no, she had to play the hero. The sound of sirens began to echo in the distance. Lauren smiled, still protected behind her equipment. "Too late, Whitman. The whole world is about to learn your secrets." Charles drew a gun, but before he could take aim, Catherine emerged from the shadows, knocking him out with a precise blow. The security guards reacted, but were surprised by federal agents who burst through the windows. "FBI, everybody down!" Smoke and chaos mixed as agents overpowered Whitman's men. Elizabeth clung to Michael, tears streaming down her face as they watched Charles Whitman being handcuffed. "It's over," Lauren said, approaching them. "The story is out. All the major media outlets are publishing it now." Michael hugged Elizabeth, feeling the trembling in his body gradually subside. Through the broken windows of the studio, the lights of Los Angeles shone like silent witnesses to a truth that could no longer be hidden. The justice that Alexandra had so desperately sought would finally be done. The morning after Charles Whitman's fall dawned with Los Angeles in an uproar. The headlines of the main newspapers splashed details of the Whitman Foundation's child trafficking scheme, while